Hey there, good morning. Kathy Spooner here. And today I want to talk about what are some things that you can do, or what are the benefits about having specific expectations for involvement of parents in the play therapy process. I think for me, I remember, so I, I remember in second grade, and I promise this story will relate because this kind of drives my way of thinking about the work that I do, and not only with clients, also the work that I do helping child and adolescent therapists, play therapists, really develop skills for excellence. And I feel like that sometimes can feel like it's a lot of pressure that I put on myself and maybe I put on others. It's not really intended that way. It's more for me a way of thinking about, if I'm going to do a job, if I'm going to do something, why would I want to do it half-ass? So that doesn't mean I always do excellent. It just means that my way of thinking about integrity in the way that I provide services and the way that I help other mental health professionals is really about leveling up to excellence. I'm not always excellent. And it's the way in which I think about my role working with clients, and also my role working with you, with play therapists, and helping you develop your unique gifts and your authentic self within that therapeutic relationship. Because I think we need to um, figure that out, because that talks about our therapeutic presence in the therapy session. That therapeutic use of self means that I have to be authentic to who I am and use the skills and knowledge that I've developed over time. And then how does that look when I show up in the playroom? And how does that look when you show up in the playroom, when you show up talking with clients, when you show up talking with parents? What does that look like using your unique gifts and talents and abilities, but also that foundational process of whatever the theoretical lens you're operating out? Like play therapy has certain ways that you implement the model. There are different theoretical models. So which one are you going to use? And how does that look for you? So here's my story. So this is, it's always weird why you remember what you remember and what seems to be pivotal. So I was in second grade, and I remember, so when I was in second grade, we had blackboards and the teacher used chalk. We had these little desks that we all sat in rows. And I remember my second grade teacher had a guest come in to talk to the class, which I don't remember what she did. I do remember, I think we were talking about grammar or something like that, teaching us grammar skills or something. And the guest said something along the lines of, if you're going to do something, do it well. Why would you want to do anything and not do your best? To this day, I remember that went like a lightning bolt through my little second grader brain. Like, yeah, that's true. And it's been one of those things that's kind of guided my life. I'm sure it's has more to do with my personality and things like that. Like in my mind, if I'm going to do something, why would I do it half-ass? I strive to go all in most of the time. And avoid burnout whenever possible. So I've learned over the last gazillion years to figure out a way to balance that out. While at the same time, I really don't believe that any of us get into the mental health field working with children and adolescents I don't think we get into the field thinking, oh, I'm just going to be mediocre. I think most of us get into the field because we want to help people and we want to do our best helping people. And when it comes to working with children, then then the context in which you work with children and your way of conceptualizing and thinking about what that work looks like is going to be based on a variety of things. One thing it does need to include is how are you conceptualizing parents in the process? And my other big theory is work smarter, not harder, because if I'm going to be striving for excellence all the time, I don't want to burn myself out. So I have to come up with strategies that are going to help to balance out, making sure I can accomplish that excellence while not burning myself out and being realistic. And that's really what I want to talk about today as it relates to how can you maximize treatment outcomes for your child and adolescent clients using play therapy, using expressive arts. How can you do that without overwhelming your schedule, without overwhelming your time, without burning you out? Because that is key. So if you're joining me live today, go ahead and post your name in the comments. I would love to see who's here. Post your name, post where you're from, what population you work with, what does your work with parents look like. Go ahead and post that in the comments. Also, for if you're watching on the replay, go ahead and post your name. I would love to hear where you're from, what population you're working with, what play therapy and expressive arts modalities are you learning or using, and how are you integrating parents in that process. So go ahead, post your name in the comments. I'm Kathy Spooner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and registered play therapist supervisor here in the United States with 30 years experience in the mental health field, working with children, adolescents, and families. Prior to working in mental health, I was a full-time special education teacher in a self-contained classroom with children in elementary school who had emotional problems. And that's actually back in the mid 80s where I actually got introduced to play therapy. And that kind of guided my journey, my professional journey moving forward, because I realized I didn't really want to teach. I really wanted to do this therapy thing that I had learned about and work with. I've always wanted to work with children and adolescents. I'm like one of those weird people, which I think is cool, who's always known what I want to do. I was planning on saving the world when I was young, and I was going to save all of the children and their families. Somewhere along the line, I got realistic about that. So today, that's what I want to talk about. What are some ways that you can maximize positive treatment outcomes for your clients so that you can make a difference in their lives? And you're the facilitator of how that goes because you're the therapist. So how are you going to do that without burning out? That's the key. And without burning out means managing your schedule, managing your time, and managing how you're working with clients, because it can get overwhelming. We walk alongside people with some really challenging things going on in their lives, and it's painful and it's hard and it's emotionally difficult sometimes holding that space for your clients. So the key is, in my mind, how do you manage that so that you don't get burned out? And a big component of that is managing your expectations, figuring out your expectations, and managing your time in between sessions. So first and foremost, think about the benefit of figuring out your expectations. So, what do I mean by that? Figuring out your expectations. To me, this has a lot to do with what clinical lens are you using that is guiding your decision making for the play therapy process, the treatment process, using expressive arts and play therapy. Most of us, when we were in graduate school, got theory training predominantly on individual oriented clinical models. I think most of you, myself included, probably went to a university to get your master's degree, and there wasn't really, there might have been an elective class. Maybe you had one class where they talked about family therapy, but out of all of the credits, 60 credits here in the United States, 60 educational hours in the in your graduate program, probably got one. Unless you're a marriage and family therapist, then you got a ton. But most people got only an individual theoretical model, and most people didn't have classes that talked about working with children and play therapy in your program. So you've had to do all of that postgraduate. Most people, there are some programs here in the United States where there are play therapy components to the training. So what that means is most people tend to have an individual theoretical model that's guiding their treatment. When you're working with children, though, children do not exist by themselves. They have a whole family that comes along with them, and that family makeup, so to speak, varies on a lot of things, like two-parent family, single-parent family, raised by other caregivers or guardians. The thing is, though, they still live within a family because they can't live on their own because they're children and they rely on grown-ups. So in my mind, one of the things to figure out is, are you using an individual theoretical model, or are you using a family systems lens that you are conceptualizing what's going on with your client? Maybe you're using an attachment lens. I like using family systems and attachment lens to conceptualize my client within their system. And the thing that makes the difference about what lens you're using is it's going to guide your treatment decision making. So if I'm using a family systems lens, the way in which I conceptualize my client and what's going on and how to address it is going to be based on that family systems lens. And that's going to guide my decision making through the treatment process. So first and foremost, I think it's important for you to figure out, am I using an individual therapy lens to conceptualize my client? Am I using a family systems lens to conceptualize my client? Am I using an attachment lens to conceptualize my client? And because from there, once you identify what your clinical lens is, then you're going to be communicating expectations and figuring out what are your expectations. So, for example, I have a family systems lens and an attachment lens. And with that lens, the way in which I conceptualize the role of parents or caregivers. So when I say parents, in my mind, that means any adult in a caregiving guardian role, the person that the child relies upon to get all their needs met through life. So I just use parent as a general term in that way. So the way the way in which I conceptualize the role of parents is dependent upon my family systems and attachment lens. So for me, that means parents are a critical partner in the change process. The parent is a therapeutic agent of change for their child because the parent has influence over the child's daily life. The parent is influencing the ability for the child to regulate emotions via co-regulation, the way in which the child is learning to conceptualize self, conceptualize relationships, and conceptualize others. So here we're kind of talking about that attachment. I add in a little neuroscience here, that concept of mentalization or attachment theory, which John Bowlby would call that internal working models. Daniel Siegel would call those maps, me maps, you maps, and we maps with his mind sight theory. All of those are conceptualizing the child with their significant adult, their caregiver, their parent in their life. So if I'm looking at it that way, that's going to then change the way in which I see parents in the treatment process. And then from there, I'm going to be coming up with, what are my expectations? And so your clinical lens guides your decision making, but a big part of that is it then guides what are going to be your expectations. So that's the first part, is what are your expectations? And it's going to be based on those things, because once you determine what your expectations are, then you're going to figure out a plan for what that looks like. But first you have to figure out your expectations, because if you don't know what your expectations are, you can't figure out your plan. If you don't know what your plan is, you can't implement your plan. And the thing about figuring out your plan is you really need to, this is where you set it up for success. You set it up for success by communicating these expectations to parents from that very first phone call, from that very first psychosocial assessment meeting. You're communicating that from the very beginning of the treatment process, not somewhere along down the line. And you can do that because you already know what they are based on your lens. And you already have an expectation and a lens that you're looking through that helps you understand the role that parents need to play in the treatment process, in the clinical work that you're doing with your young clients, children and adolescents. I would also include adolescents. I know sometimes therapists will say, well, they're an adolescent, they need to individuate. And I agree with that. They do need to individuate. They do need that to move towards that process of launching. The thing is, though, they don't launch and live in their life independent of their primary relationships. It changes, and the way in which adolescents and young adults have relationships with their parents will change through their lifetime. But how many of you still have contact with your family members? Probably the vast majority of you still have relationships with your family members. And so to me, adolescents, part of what we want to help them do is figure out who they are within this system and help the system be able to interact and relate and have relationship in as healthy a way as possible. We're not talking about perfection here. We're talking about good enough. More often than not, that somebody can feel loved and valued for who they are, and also have skills for working through conflict, because when you're in relationships, you also have conflicts. So that's part of, I think, for adolescents, you still want to use that lens, because those are still important skills for them to learn. So once you know what your expectations are, then you can figure out what your plan is going to be. And that plan includes how you're going to communicate with parents in between sessions. How often do you need to meet with parents? Do you need to meet with them separately without the child? Do you need to meet with them with the child? Do you do both? How often does that happen? And then once you figure out those expectations, That also includes how are you going to manage when the privacy piece. So if you're also seeing clients, your child and adolescent clients in an individual session, and you are coordinating, collaborating with parents as partners, how are you going to manage that privacy? What is that going to look like? What are you going to say and not say? What are you going to do when you have to deal with the gray areas of mandated reporting? They are not really reportable. They don't fall under the mandated reporting laws in which the law states you have to report these to Child Protective Services, but they fall in that area of, this is not healthy. They could be in danger. Some really challenging things could be happening here, but they've said it in an individual session. Depending on your state laws here in the US or what the country that you're in, will determine age of consent and privacy. That kind of varies by age, by state. So, what are your expectations about that? Because if you work with adolescents, that is going to put you in a bind. So, I learned a long time ago when I was working in community mental health. It's like 30 years ago because I've always worked with children and adolescents. That's been the population where I feel called to help. And so if you got to figure that part out, otherwise you're going to be in a lot of binds, and you want to be effective while also navigating those ethical decisions that you have to make, as well as legal and safety decisions. So what are your expectations about that? You need to communicate that up front. I have a no secrets policy. I don't communicate and disclose what the secret is, but we are going to address it. I like that DBT framework so DBT, the dialectic is acceptance and change. And some of the primary targets are, is it life interfering? So is it a safety concern? Is my client at risk of being harmed? Is it suicide risk or homicide risk or something like that? Then is it a life interfering behavior, something going on in their life that really is going to interfere with their ability to live a life worth living from a DBT standpoint? And then the other one is a therapy interfering behavior. And a therapy interfering behavior is anything that gets in the way of progress being made in treatment. So multiple missed sessions and avoidance of sessions, not doing the homework, those can all be considered therapy interfering behaviors. The other thing that can be, in my mind, are secrets. Those can be therapy interfering behaviors. They're not for me to disclose. It does become a focus of treatment about what's going on with that and what needs to happen in order to work through that to get the breakthrough that's needed to have that life worth living. So you want to figure out how you're going to manage secrets. Those are based on your theoretical and clinical lens as well. They have their roots in that. You want to figure out how you're going to handle missed appointments, how you're going to handle parents not coming in when you're trying to schedule appointments with them, or maybe you're only getting one parent, and for lots of reasons, the other parent just doesn't come in. How are you going to handle that? It's going to be based on your theoretical lens. And then what are your expectations about that? Because then you're going to have a plan for how you're going to carry out and address that. So you want to have, once you figure out your expectations, then that helps you figure out what your plan is. And once you figure out what your plan is, then you can communicate that. So what is your plan for email and phone calls and texts in between sessions? How are you going to handle those? Because those can be a big time consuming situation if you're responding to texts at all times or emails. By the way, I really do not encourage people to communicate via text or email. to me, it's much more effective to have those conversations in the parent sessions. There's so many things ethically and clinically that can go on using text and using email. I really don't think we should be using those to have therapy discussions, clinical discussions of any depth. I think they're fine for, scheduling appointments and things like that. I really think, though, it's much more effective, as well as saves time, to have that expectation of meeting with parents in person, or if you're doing telehealth, doing it via telehealth. But if you have your expectations, that's part of your plan. How are you going to manage that? And then you'll be able, because you have a plan that's based on your expectations, rooted in your clinical theoretical lens, then you're going to be able to do that with more confidence. Sometimes it takes a little time to work up to that, because when we have to hold boundaries, that can be hard to hold those therapeutic boundaries and then manage the emotional component that goes with that, both sides. So once you have that plan, then you can communicate it much more effectively right from the beginning. You have a lens that you're working out of, so you feel more comfortable that this plan is rooted and grounded in sound clinical decision making. And then the other thing is, if you have that plan in place and you've communicated it, really reinforces the necessity of those parent meetings, those at least with therapists and parents. It really reinforces the importance of having those regular sessions. My expectation in the beginning that I communicate is, well, at least monthly in the beginning. I'll meet with parents without the child present, just to kind of get the process started where we need to go. It also saves time, because you're not feeling like you have to chase parents down. You already have a process in place. If for some reason they aren't really engaging and you're having a hard time getting them, then that goes back to your expectations to help you develop a plan, how you're going to manage that. What kind of boundaries are you going to be holding about that? And it really gives you the ability to develop strong therapeutic rapport with parents. And that's where part of that change process comes, when you have that really solid relationship with parents, to bring them in as partners into the change process. And when I work with therapists and I do online supervision group, this is one of the things that we talk about a lot. A lot of what I do is help therapists in the supervision not only figure out what theoretical model they're going to use. Most people use an integrated approach. How are you doing that? Also, how are you conceptualizing the role of parents in the play therapy process? So in supervision group, we talk about that a lot. When I do trainings, we talk about that a lot, because the idea is for you to figure out what that looks like for you, using your unique gifts and talents, your theory models that you're working on. How are you going to take some of these elements that are really important? How are you going to take those and integrate those into the way in which you provide therapy? And I do have a training coming up on this Saturday, June 25th. And that's a lot of what we talk about in the training. It's only 2.5 hours, but we do a lot of group interaction. And to me, one of the reasons the group interaction is so important in this training is because it gives you the opportunity to take some of these things that I'm talking about, kind of get some other ideas with your colleagues. What are they seeing? What are some things they've tried? And coming up with some expectations of your own and your way of communicating different things, like communicating privacy. How do you communicate about what play therapy is to help parents understand and get their buy-in. And even we go through a lot of things that might be going on for parents that make them a little more challenging. These are the higher acuity family systems. So, what might be some of the things going on with them so that you can use a framework, a lens, a theory model to help develop expectations and a plan to help even challenging family systems, challenging parents engage in the change process for their child and to partner with you. And that will cut down on some of that burnout in between sessions, chasing, feeling like you have to chase parents, um, scheduling those meetings, in between communication. All of that can be really overwhelming. I remember that feeling that way sometimes, thinking, holy smokes, man, this is a lot of work in between sessions. And my goal is work smarter, not harder. So that's where I thought about, okay, what are my expectations? These are based on my default. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, but I always say, in my heart, I'm a marriage and family therapist, really in my heart, because of the way in which I conceptualize working with children and adolescents. So I remember thinking, if I don't come up with a plan, if I don't figure out my expectations, I am not going to make it in this field. I am going to burn out. And I did not want to burn out because I really believe this is my calling in life. This is my purpose in life, to help families heal, to help children heal. And now, like 30 years in, part of my mission in life is to help you be that therapist of excellence without burning out, working smarter, not harder. What does that look like? Because the way that I look at it is my ability to help more families and children heal is grows exponentially because you are able to help more people, and then I help you, you help more people, and then you help people, and then they help people. It's like, I don't know how many of you are my age. We had that Breck shampoo. I think it was back in the 70s or 80s. Pretty sure it was the 70s. The Breck, you tell two people and they'll tell two people, and those two people will tell two people. And then you'd see like more and more squares on the commercial. Like your influence vastly begins to expand. So that is, to me, that's what's important, is helping you to really be effective and not burn out at the same time. And in order to do that, having a plan, recognizing your expectations for how you are going to work with parents and their families. That is a critical piece. Parents as partners, parents as the therapeutic agents of change for their child, and you are supporting parents so that they can be that therapeutic agent of change for their child. And you are that support person for parents. So once you know what your expectations are, then you can communicate those to parents. All righty. So just as a recap for today, first and foremost, figuring out what is your clinical lens, because that lens provides like the scaffolding or the infrastructure for the way in which you provide treatment. So think about it like a house. You have to have the what do you call those? The beams and the framing. You have to have the framing in the house so that when you start putting the walls on it and you start putting floors in there and furniture, it's all going to hold up to all of those additional things. First, you've got to get your expectations identified, and that's going to be based on whatever clinical lens that you're using, because that clinical lens guides all of your decision making. So once you figure out your clinical lens, then you can figure out what are your expectations for how parents are going to be involved in the change process and what does that look like. And then once you figure out those things, your expectations based on your clinical lens, then you can figure out what plan is going to work for you. How are you going to communicate your expectations to parents about their involvement in the change process? What does that look like? And here's the thing. In my mind, I remember a long time ago, because I want to say this because it can come across rude, and I don't want it to come across rude, and it can come across rude. So let me back up a minute and say this. I've been doing this for 30 years. Prior to that, I worked with families in a different capacity. So I've been working with children and their families since my bachelor program because we had to do a ton of volunteer time. Plus, we had to do the student teaching. So I've been around families. I worked with children and families in summer camp. I have been around children and families, and here's what I've learned. Let me rephrase that. A lot of times we have a tendency in the profession to blame parents when things aren't working out, when they aren't doing what we think they need to do. And I think it's important for us as professionals to take a step back and think about, okay, well, did I communicate to them what's expected? Do I know what I'm expecting? It's kind of like when you're in a marriage and you get married and like you have all these expectations, but you don't really know their expectations until you've been married for a little while and your partner is making you mad because he or she is not doing what you thought they should be doing. So you recognize all of these unconscious expectations, and then I have to figure it out from there. Well, I see that the same in play therapy and therapy. What are my expectations? Have I identified those and communicated those right from the very beginning? Because parents are looking to you as the expert. They are looking to you to know how this works. This is our everyday life, thinking mental health and how it works and what are the expectations. I think sometimes we forget clients and parents, they don't know these things. This is not their world that they work and live in. So I think we have a responsibility to figure that out and then communicate them and help them understand how it's going to work. And if there are any barriers for their engagement, something going on with them, figure out what that is and have those conversations with the parents to help them engage more fully in the treatment process. I don't really think it is fair for us to blame parents when things aren't working the way we think they need to work and probably the way they do need to work if you haven't really built that rapport and helped them understand what that looks like. I think that's on the therapist to do that. Does it mean we don't work with high acuity parents and families? No, that's not what I'm talking about. But even those families, I still think it's important that there's a way in which we communicate and implement the plan that's going to help to engage them more effectively. That's the infrastructure. That's the scaffolding that if you don't have that in place, that therapy process is not going to hold up as well. So that is it for today. Those are my tips. Those are the benefits. If you are interested, I do have a training coming up on Saturday. Registration is closing soon. And in this training, you are going to get that plan. You are going to identify those expectations. You are going to have an idea about how to communicate, how to get parents involved. If there are barriers, what might those barriers be? How can you address those? You are going to come out of this with a plan that's going to save you time, emotional distress, not completely, and a way to have parents more effectively involved in the change process. So that's going to be coming up this Saturday, June 25th. It's in the morning. It's online. It's only 2.5 hours. It's 2.5 hours jam-packed of really good conversations. So if you are interested in the training, you can go to my website at rrhcounseling.com/courses. And the training is called Parents in the Play Therapy Process. There's 2 versions. One, if you want continuing education hours, and one if you do not want continuing education hours. So you want to make sure you sign up for the right course if you're interested in that course. I will also post a link in the comments. So if you need that, or feel free to message me. Feel free, if you have questions about the training, feel free to message me. Or if you need the link, feel free to message me. And I will see you next week. Bye.